The seventh commandment of the Torah is the commandment of lo tinaf, that one should not commit adultery. And the Rambam mentions this in the negative commandments number 347. And he goes on to say that it's forbidden to have relations with one's neighbor's wife. And the source of this commandment, do not lie with your neighbor's wife. To understand this commandment on 5 levels, on the level of Pshat, Remez, Drush, Soid, and also Chassidus. What is the simple meaning of lo tinaf? So Rashi tells us that lo tinaf means adultery, and therefore this prohibition relates primarily to another man's wife. However, the Even Ezra goes on to say that lo tinaf does not only mean adultery, but rather lo tinaf means any act of immorality. And he quotes the teachings of Rabbi Gaon, and he says that there are 6 levels of immorality. He says the first type of immorality is that one should not have intimacy simply out of wedlock. That's the first level. The second level is if a woman is a nida and she menstruates, she first must go to mikveh. If not, one violates this commandment of lo tinaf. The third level is someone else's wife, adultery. The fourth level of the prohibition of immorality is to have relations with a non-Jew. The 5th level is a man with a man. And the 6th level would be a man with an animal, bestiality. And all of them, says Rabbi Gaon, is part of the commandment of lo tinaf, do not commit any act of immorality. We spoke in the previous commandment that God gave 10 commandments on 2 tablets. 5 commandments on one, 5 on the other. He didn't give one tablet of all 10 commandments, but rather he divided it 5 and 5. One interpretation is that the first 5 primarily deal between man and God, and the second 5 commandments deal with the commandments between man and man. The Kli Yakar explains that the reason that there's 5 and 5 is that the first and the 6th parallel one the other, and the 2nd and the 7th parallel each other, etc., etc. So according to the Kli Yakar, the 2nd commandment of you shall not have any other gods before you, or as long as I live, is consistent or parallel to the commandment to not commit adultery. And he goes on to say what's the connection, and he gives an example from the story in the portion of Balak, how after Bilam tried to curse the Jewish people, and he saw that the Jews cannot be cursed. On the contrary, every time he cursed us, he blessed us instead. So he finally realized that the only way to cause the children of Israel to be punished is through the fact that he brings the sin of immorality. And so he advised the daughters of Moab to let themselves free and to seduce the Jewish men. And by doing so, they would cause the Jewish people to be punished. And there it says that as the women seduce the men to this level of immorality, they would pull out the god of Baal Peor, and say, before you can have me, you have to bow down to this god. And so therefore we see that the concept of do not bow down to other gods is parallel to the concept of lo tinaf, which is do not commit acts of immorality. And we also find this in the reverse in the Deuteronomy chapter 7:1. Over there it talks about the prohibition of intermarriage, and it says, if you do, then you should know ki yasir es binche ma'acharai. If you do this, you should know that your son will go astray. And there, as the commentaries explain, from here we derive that it is the Jewish mother that determines the nationality of the child. If the mother is Jewish and the father is not Jewish, then the child is Jewish. If the father is Jewish but the mother is not Jewish, even if the father is as great as Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses all together, yet if the wife is not Jewish, the child is not Jewish. And this is based on the passage of Ki Yasir es bincha me'acharai, because we see that the mother who will give birth to this Jewish child will now be taken astray with the father who is not Jewish, who is the idolater. So it works both ways. And therefore the second commandment parallels the seventh commandment.
Other than the sixth?
We now move on to Remez. Remez is the hint. We know that Lo Tinaf is not only a commandment but also a promise. It also represents the future, that in the future there will come a time that there will be no immorality in the world, and there will be no sin, God forbid, of adultery in the world. And that will be when Mashiach comes. And therefore, in reverse, the mitzvah or the commandment of Leit Tinaf represents to have a good marriage. And especially the ultimate marriage, which is the marriage between God and the Jewish people. And that will take place when Mashiach comes. And that is why in the blessings of the Sheva Brachos, we say, Kol Sasoin, Kol Simcha, there should be the voice of Sasoin and Simcha, Kol Chasoin, Kol Kala, the voice of the Chason and the Kala, etc., etc. And then we say, this concept of koil, this terminology of voice, is mentioned 5 times. The gematria of voice of koil in Hebrew is 136. 136 times 5 equals 680, which is the gematria of the word pras, which means from the Euphrates. It says that the land of Israel and the borders of Israel begin from the Euphrates. And therefore, by singing this song to the Chasan and Kala, we are hinting to the fact that when Mashiach will come, there will be the wedding between God and the Jewish people, and then once again the borders of Israel will be reestablished. Also, in the actual song or blessing, we say, Mehera Yishama Ba'ara Yehuda. Very soon we shall hear in the cities of Judah. Judah represents the king of Israel, who comes from the tribe of Judah. Uvechutzei Yerushalayim, and the courtyards of Jerusalem is the place where the temple will be rebuilt. And so every chasana, every Jewish wedding is one step closer to the ultimate wedding between God and the Jewish people. So this is the remez. This is the hint from Lo Tinaf. Then we move on to Drush. We find a very interesting Rambam. The Rambam said like this: there is nothing more difficult for the Jewish people than the laws of chastity. To separate and refrain from prohibited relations, and to follow all the laws as the Torah dictates. And the Rambam goes on to say, when the Jews heard the laws of chastity, they began to cry. They cried. And it says in the Pasuk in Numbers, Vayishma Moshe es ha'am, that Moses heard the nation, and they were crying. Why were they crying? They were crying because of the account of the prohibitions of the laws of family, of the laws of intimacy. So to paraphrase, what do we see from this? The Jews cried when it came to these laws of chastity, but they didn't cry when it came to the laws of Yom Kippur. They didn't cry when it came to the laws of Passover. In other words, the Jews said, look, we'll eat matzah for 7 days and nights, no problem. We'll be happy to fast on Yom Kippur, no problem. But don't take away the laws of intimacy. Don't give us the laws of chastity. That's too difficult. We'll do everything else, but that is very, very hard for us. And they were crying. But yet the Torah says, Lo tinaf. If God gave us a commandment, every commandment that God gives us, He gives us together with strength. And therefore we have the ability to overcome all of these temptations and to truly live a life of modesty and holiness.
Straight? What's that? Straight?
So this is the concept of drush. Then we move on to the level of sod, which is the esoteric level. In chapter 7 of Tanya, the Alter Rebbe writes the following. What are the sins that one cannot correct? That is one who has relations with a married woman of another man and gives birth to a bastardish child. And therefore, even tshuva, even repentance cannot help. The Rebbe explains that in truth, there's nothing that stands beyond tshuva, and therefore even for this you can do tshuva. However, the average tshuva doesn't help, but a tshuva that comes from a deep place, a place from love and return, a true altruistic connection with God, of course this tshuva atones for every sin that a person commits, God forbid, in the world. And to use the words of Kabbalah, that this sin of creating a bastardish child is because of the fact that the seed of the man goes down into the Yesod Nukva of Klippa. It goes into the feminine aspect of the Klippa of the shell. So that is the concept of Lo tinaf based on the esoteric level. And then you have the Hasidic interpretation, the fifth level in the Torah. And the approach of Hasidus is as follows. In general, Hasidus believes that the relationship between man and God is not that of a relationship between a king and a citizen, or even between a father and a son, but rather it's a deeper relationship. It's a relationship between a husband and wife. And therefore, based on this concept that God is our husband, God is the man, and we are the bride, it makes a lot of sense why the second commandment of you shall not have any other gods is parallel to the seventh commandment of Lo tinaf. Because if we have other gods and we don't serve our God properly, this is tantamount to adultery. Because our love to God is a love of a husband to a wife, and from a wife to a husband. And therefore this intense love is so powerful that if we do things outside of Torah, this is called Lo tinaf, to not commit adultery. And this explains an interesting statement in the Talmud. The Talmud says, Ein Adam over Avera, Elam Kain Nichnas Boi Ruach Shtus. And that is, a person does not commit a sin unless a spirit of folly enters into that person. Why? Because a Jew by nature cannot and does not want to sever his relationship with God. So why does a Jew sin if he cannot sever his relationship with God? A spirit of folly entered into the person. That's what the Talmud says. And then the Talmud goes on to say, what's the proof? It brings a proof from a passage in the Torah, in the Bible, that says, Hisishte ishtoi, that if a man's wife will go astray, and she will be suspected of infidelity, which are the laws of Sota. And the question is asked, why does the Gemara need to bring a proof from this passage of a woman who is suspected of infidelity? Infidelity is a very serious crime. And here the Gemara is trying to prove that any sin that a man does, even a small sin, is also because of a spirit of folly that enters into him. So why do we bring such a heavy proof that a woman who will go astray because of spirit of folly this is the proof for any person who commits a small sin as well. And there are three answers to this. The first answer, as we explained earlier, that our relationship with God is that of a husband and wife. And therefore, even a small sin is a violation of the marriage. If it's simply a citizen to a king, so if you commit a major sin, okay, we understand it's a capital crime. But the smaller sins is nicht gefährlich, perhaps. It's not so terrible. Who's going to see? Who's going to know? That might be a person's warped way of thinking. However, when it comes to a relationship between husband and wife, it's no difference if you violate the relationship with adultery, or even, God forbid, if you violate the relationship with another prohibited act. If you trust each other and you love each other, and your spouse says, please don't do this, this bothers me very much, and you do this, you are violating the marriage. And therefore the Torah connects this relationship between man and God as a relationship of love and commitment and purity. The second reason why the Gemara brings a proof from a sota, a woman that is suspected of infidelity, is to teach us that even suspicion is out of place. Even suspicion is inappropriate for a Jew. In other words, if we do something and people will think that what we're doing is wrong, even if what we are doing is correct, then perhaps we have to refrain from that act. Because we are married to God. We are married to the King of all kings. We are queens. And therefore, our actions have to be very, very pure and very clean. And if there is a suspicion in our actions, that already is a violation of the marriage. And finally, the sota, the one who is suspected of infidelity, must temporarily leave her husband until she drinks the waters of the holy temple, and then it becomes clear and evident that she never sinned. So in other words, eventually, when we find out that she's clean and pure, she now reunites with her husband. And the unity is a greater unity. And the Gemara gives an example that if up until now she gave birth with difficulty, then after this reunion, the birth will be very easy. And here too the Talmud is hinting that our relationship with God is the same thing. And that is, a Jew cannot and does not want to sever his relationship with God. And if accidentally we do something that is animalistic, if we do something which is prohibited, and we sever our relationship with God, you should know it's only like a sota. It's only temporarily. Because eventually we're going to see how every Jew loves God, and how every Jew is connected to God, and how every Jew truly wants to be one with God. So we hope and pray that very soon we will see the marriage between God and the Jewish people. And therefore we're going to sing the songs in the streets, Ba'arei Yehuda v'chutzei Yerushalayim, the songs of Kel Sasem v'Kel Simcha, Kel Chasem v'Kel Kala, and to see the rebuilding of the third holy temple speedily in our days.